Hope all of you are doing well. So today we will talk about what are APIs and how APIs work and they perform validation, authentication. Because I think without knowing the basic knowledges, we can't get through the testing and seeing the code and understanding it. Because after that, I'm going to show you the code. I'm going to show you the procedure of how APIs are being constructed. So stick to it. So what are APIs? An API, application programming interface, is basically a set of rules or protocols that allow different software applications to interact with each other. They use different, you can say, methods or data structures that developers make so that they can communicate with external software, operating systems, libraries, or services to fetch some data around the backend servers. So first of all, we will talk about how APIs work. So this is basically a user. A user can be any front-end device and any front-end mobile application, and he wants specific data to fetch from the database or fetch from the backend servers. So he will send an HTTP request, and that HTTP request will be sent to the API, and API will perform the validation authentication depending upon how that API is being constructed, and after that he will send the response back to the user. So user should know that what its response will be, because and depending upon what that response or what he is expecting in the response, he will send that HTTP request. Like if he wants to fetch some data, so he will get send an get HTTP request. If he wants to alter some data around the API, he will send post HTTP request. And if he wants to delete any post or delete any data around the API server, because I think he will be admin, so he will send a delete request around the API, and API will then send different SQL queries, perform different SQL queries depending upon the HTTP request he made, and that SQL queries will directly communicate with the database, and that database will perform that all actions and alter data around the database. These are the terms you should know before diving into how APIs are made. And if you don't know any part, don't worry, I will explain each and everything so you won't be left with any ambiguities. First of all, what is SQL? SQL stands for Structured Query Language, and it is basically a language that is used to communicate with the database. We send different queries, and depending upon that queries, we get different data from the database. If I show you the basic structure, how we write these queries, so there are three tables: post, products, and users. This data basically is related to, I think, posts. But if we want specific data from the users table, I can write this query, and after writing this query, I can basically get all the data from the users table. So this is all the data from the users table. This is how we communicate with the database using SQL queries. After SQL queries, what is Postman? Postman is basically, you can say, a tool that is used to test our API, that is used to test our HTTP requests and responses. This is basic structure of Postman. Like if I have to send a get request, it sends me the response in this form. It is directly linked with the database, and the database sends back the data to this tool, and we can easily see what status is being run and what problem are we going through. If there is any problem, we can directly check that problem in our code and fix that. So it is a very good tool to basically communicate directly with our database and fetch different results. Third part is deployment phase: Heroku, Ubuntu machine, AWS. After we create an API, we have to deploy that API on different servers, so everyone can use without uploading it on the servers. It is basically running on our local server. So if any other person wants to check our API or wants to see our API how it is working, it won't be able to do that without any deployment. Fourth is known as git push pull code. So basically, git push command is used to upload your local repository content to a remote repository, and the git pull command is used to fetch integrate changes from the remote repository to your local repository. So this is how basically a git push pull command works, or we can change our repository, we can execute and update our repository, so that if any other person wants to see our code, he or she can easily see that. CI/CD pipelines are basically used to streamline the flow of deployment. CI stands for, I think, continuous integration, continuous deployment. So it is used for basically streamlining the whole flow of deploying API on the server using GitHub Actions. Tech stack used is Python. Python is used to basically write the whole code. Fast API framework is used to create the API, and it is very handy because we have auto documentation, so we won't be able to create a silly front end to show our API. SQL, I have told you. PostgreSQL is basically that application on which we write different SQL queries, and there are different SQL query commands. If we don't have to write SQL query, we use SQL Alchemy models, so directly communicate with the database. We don't have to write different, you know, SQL queries. We have to directly write different Python commands, and that Python commands directly integrates and communicate with the database. We have different pydantic models. Pydantic models are basically structure. If I show you this is our basically pydantic model, in which we create different structures, that how this post or how this response should be. In this part, we are going to talk about what are ORMs. ORM stands for Object Relational Mapper. It is a layer of abstraction between the database and the API server. Like if I talk about a traditional method, in a traditional method, we send different SQL queries to the database, and that database sends that data back to the API server. But in this part, if we don't know how to communicate with the SQL queries, and we don't like to communicate with the SQL queries, we can use the other method, in which we have to write different Python code, and that Python code is then sent to the ORM. Basically, ORM is SQL Alchemy. SQL Alchemy is basically a library which is known as ORM, and that Python code is converted to SQL code using that ORM, and eventually the database just understands SQL, so it will execute that SQL query, and after that it will send data back to the API, and API will send that data back to the important process of developing an API, because without validation it will be vulnerable to attackers, and they can easily fetch information what they want. So basically there are two ways for authentication of an API. One is session based authentication, and the other is known as the JWT token based authentication. In session based authentication, we have to store something on our backend to track whether a user is logged in or not. But in the other method, JWT token based authentication method, there is nothing in our database or API that stores information about something. Token is just created, stored on the front end side, and then we validate. So how tokens are created? There are three parts of a token: header, payload, and signature. Header, it contains basically the metadata of the token. Algorithm specifies the algorithm, specifies the type of the token, what type of the token it is. The payload, it contains the uh, claims about the entity, that whether the user is admin or he is a small normal user. Basically we do not have to put much information in the payload, so that it would not increase the size of the packet and eventually waste of some bandwidths. And signature, it is the combination of encoded header and encoded payload. So this is the basic structure of an token. After understanding this, we can easily understand how validation works. So this is the user. The user basically sends a username and password to the API. The API checks that username or password. If it is correct, it will sign a JWT token and send back to the user. The user will send again any HTTP request he wants data from. So he will send a HTTP request alongside that token. That token will be sent to the API. The API will now perform the validation, and it uses the same secret key that was used to create the JWT token. It uses the same secret key, and that secret key will again create a new signature, and that signature will be compared with the older signature that was created at the time of signing of the API of the JWT token. And if it is correct, if they both match, then it means the token is verified and the data will be sent back to the user. Otherwise, if token is not verified, the data will won't be, we won't be able to send, API won't be able to send data to the user. So this is how the basic structure of the validation works. Now let's see our API in action. If I want a specific data from the database or all posts from the database, it means I'm going to send a GET request, because GET request fetches the data from the database and gives us in the response. Now if I send this request, you can easily see in the response that all the data from the database is fetched and shown in the response. This is how basically a GET request is sent, and after sending that get request, we can easily view our response. So in this part, in this request, I am not validating, I'm just sending all the data from the database to the user. No validation is being performed. Now let's say I am going to create a new post. A new post is only created by those users that are logged in into the system. If any person is not logged in into the system, he or she won't be able to create a new post, or he or she won't be able to update a new post or delete a specific post. So if I hit send, you can easily see that it is not validated, means the credentials are not validated. It means that we are not logged into the system. 401 or unauthorized means we are not logged into the system. So after that, we am going to, what I'm going to know, you can easily see that this is the email and password. This email and password is stored in the users table. If I send this email and password, the API will validate it, and if it is correct, it will send a specific token. Now that token is now again used in this post. Now this post is basically using that specific token from that login. It means now basically we are logged into the system. If I am logged into the system, it means I can create new post, I can update or delete any post. Now if I send, this is a new post that is created. 25 means this ID is 25. Now we can easily see that there is only 24 number ID. Latest ID is 24. If I run this SQL query, we can easily fetch our 25 number ID post. And if I send a GET request to send me all the posts, we can easily see that there are 25 number ID. So this is how basically a validation is performed. Now let's say I'm not giving a correct information in the email or even a password. It won't be able to log in me, invalid credentials. And invalid credentials mean we are not going to log in into the system, and we are not going to perform any of this task. If I click on send, you won't be able to post a new request. This is basically how validation works. And let's say I'm going to fetch a new specific post with a specific ID. Now this is a specific post of ID 12, and is there any ID? Yes, there is an ID of 12. If I send this request, I can easily fetch data from that specific ID. I also not validated any authentication system into this, so that we can easily understand how this system works. We can easily update any post with specific ID. We can even delete a post or create new users. So this is how basically API system works, how these systems send and get responses, and how we can validate, so that no one can alter our code, no one or alter our database, and everything is running smoothly. So thank